Greetings from the people of planet Earth.
This is a special Democracy Cast report brought to you by Democracy Watch News. Our coordinating editor and independent journalist in Seattle, Washington, Mark Taylor-Canfield, has a special report and update for us on the City Council elections in Seattle. This is currently their primary season, so they're setting up their ballot for the later general election for the City Council. There's some concern about the time of the year and other issues about what is necessary to boost voter turnout. So with that, this is Dean Edwards in Salem, Oregon. And Mark, we're ready for your report.
Yes, this is Mark Taylor-Canfield, independent reporter in Seattle. And we are indeed involved in the primary elections for Seattle City Council as well as Seattle School Board and other positions. So it's an all-mail-in ballot in Washington State. So there are no polling booths, which I sort of miss actually going to the local school or whatever for that patriotic, practice. But we are now dealing with a mail-in ballot primarily, actually exclusively in Seattle. So the re-election campaign for Socialist Alternative candidate re-election campaign for Shama Sawant is in full fourth gear mode right now. They are asking people to go ahead and mail in their ballots early. There is an early balloting system in Seattle for these races. She is running on a platform this time, which is devoted mainly to the issue of rent control. When it was elected a couple of years ago, it was on the $15 an hour minimum wage, which has now become a national campaign. In fact, there was a breaking news story today about Nancy Pelosi coming out publicly in favor of the $15 an hour minimum wage. So it's become a national movement, but it started here in Seattle with the city of SeaTac, Washington, where SeaTac Airport is located. They were the first city in the country to pass a $15 an hour minimum wage. However, it's now currently locked up in a court battle because the airport is claiming that it's owned by the Port of Seattle, and therefore this election in SeaTac did not apply to their operations, which was the main focus by the local unions, by the way, was to get those airport workers a $15 an hour minimum wage. But it did pass later in Seattle, due largely to a campaign launched by Shama Sawant, who is an avowed socialist and is a member of the Socialist Alternative Party, which has also run other candidates around the country, including the Minneapolis City Council races last time. So it has been a sort of controversial position for her in Seattle, which is currently dominated by major corporations like Starbucks, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and lately Expedia moved its corporate headquarters here. But there is a big issue in Seattle about affordable housing. A major part of the population is being displaced right now because rents are being tripled. We've talked on the Democracy Cast weekly press briefings about Angel's Shoe Repair Store, a business in Seattle that was owned by Ray Angel and his family since 1912, having their rent tripled and then given 30 days to relocate. Well, the follow-up good news story on that is that another benevolent landlord across the street has offered him a space at an affordable cost. Largely due to a lot of grassroots street-level activism, people in the community actually held a block party for him, and I've written about it as well as other people at the Stranger magazine and other places in Seattle. But Shama Sawant has taken on this issue of affordable housing as her main issue, and I have to say, as a journalist, she has definitely chosen a story that has legs. The issue of affordable housing is not going to go away. It's not going to go away in Seattle. And I've written at the Capitol Hill Times about this issue and put all of the local political candidates and political consultants on notice that this issue is not going to go away. It's a huge economic and social issue in Seattle. And just to give you a quick background context of that story, in February, our mayor, Ed Murray, the first openly gay mayor, by the way, in Seattle, and came out and said, look, there are two issues that I need to address in my State of the Union speech this year, and that is economic and racial inequality, because there's a lot of black flight in the community, where a lot of traditionally African-American communities are being wiped out because of white gentrification. And so that's a major issue. There's also accusations against the use of excessive force and racial profiling by the Department of Justice against the Seattle Police Department. So a lot of these issues are hot button, top of the news story kinds of issues locally here. And there is a huge economic shift happening in Seattle where the middle class and the traditional ethnic communities are being displaced because of the cost of housing now in Seattle with all this new corporate development. Seattle has the fastest growing rents in the country right now, and is maybe number 5 or something in terms of total development per capita. It's just the city is exploding in a way that I've never seen before. I've been here for a decade myself, and also have been in other cities like London, New York, Paris, Los Angeles. I've never seen this kind of development where entire blocks are just demolished overnight and entire neighborhoods wiped out within hours by the wrecking ball. And then the local joke here is that the construction crane is the local bird, is this official city bird, because if you look out on the horizon in downtown Seattle, you can see dozens of them, 18 at the last report. So Kshama Sawant has taken on this issue. She's definitely focused on the issue of rent control. And that is a very controversial issue in Seattle because of the fact that the Washington State Legislature has actually prohibited any form of rent control statewide. So this is an issue that cannot be overturned on the local level, which is very frustrating to a lot of housing activists in the Puget Sound area. But there are members of the city council, including Nick Licata and Kshama Sawant, who have been pushing this idea that the city officials and the county officials need to lobby the state legislature to overturn that prohibition. Because in a city like Seattle, without rent control, what results is widespread population displacement, the increase of homelessness. There are several homeless encampments around Seattle now because of all these people who, some of them who are actually working, who cannot afford to pay their rents in the city right now. So Kshama Sawant and Nick Licata, who both been on our Democracy Cast weekly press briefing, held a debate with 2 anti-rent control advocates on July 20th in Seattle, and it was standing room only. In fact, not only were members of the audience held outside because of the because it was full occupancy at that point, but even members of the press had a hard time getting in because there were so many people who packed the hall. It's a beautiful old church in downtown Seattle, Seattle's Town Hall, with stained glass windows, and it's just a beautiful place. The pro rent control advocates there were Kshama Sawant and Nick Licata, both Seattle City Council members. And unfortunately, I have to report that Nick, who's been on the City Council for many years, ever since I've lived here, is retiring this year. So that's kind of a sad news for a lot of people who have supported him and his grassroots sort of populist approach on the council. He actually was elected many years ago on this idea of rent control in Seattle. So he's been a major advocate for affordable housing ever since he's been on the council. He's also a major advocate for the arts. And the only council member I know, as far as I know, who opened some of his meetings with poetry readings by local poets. But they were debating Roger Valdez, who is a development lobbyist. So we can say right up front, he is paid by real estate development companies to speak their corporate line. And also Matt Manueller, who is a state representative from Wenatchee, Washington, on more of the conservative right-wing Republican side of things, who was also a major advocate for real estate development companies and their ability, spoken in true libertarian fashion, to make as much money as possible with no government intervention. So it was a major disagreement in the room, major schism in the crowd. There was a lot of shouting and ruckus going on because people were very upset at some of the arguments made against rent control by Valdez and Manweller. And so it caused some ruffled feathers there. The rent control debate was moderated by former president of the Seattle City Council, Peter Steinbrück, whose father, Victor Steinbrück, actually saved Pike Place Market from development back in the 70s. So this is not a new issue in Seattle. It seems to come with every housing bubble. And that is another issue, of course, that was discussed, which is this just another real estate bubble, and will it burst soon so that a lot of this overdevelopment will just be unsustainable? That tends to be the economic cycle around the rest of the country and also in Seattle, where Seattle's always been a boom and bust town ever since the Yukon gold rush, when a lot of Seattle families made fortunes outfitting the miners who headed up to Alaska. And then the Boeing company moved here, and then Microsoft is over in Redmond, which is just east of Lake Washington in Seattle. So it's now become a major corporate headquarters for many multinational corporations, and the real estate prices have just skyrocketed through the roof, like unprecedented. So during this rent control meeting, some of the arguments used against rent control by Roger Valdez and Matt Manweller were things like, well, it restricts businesses from making as much money as they want. And if people want to have cheaper rent, they can always move to a different location. So it's basically this argument that this is economic choice, that people in Seattle choose to live in 200 square foot studio apartments that cost $1,000 a month because that's where they want to live, and you shouldn't restrict their choice. On the other side, Salant and Licata were saying that these arguments by the anti-rent control policy advocates were bogus and not based on correct information. What they pointed out was that all of the apocalyptic scenarios that were presented by the anti-rent control advocates are already happening in Seattle. The anti-rent control advocates were claiming that rents would skyrocket. There would be, more displacement of the African American community in the city, and that it would become an incredibly unaffordable place to live. Well, Salant and Licata pointed out that that's already happened in Seattle. So their arguments against rent control seem specious only because, and this is my editorial point of view, because all of the scenarios that they're spinning about what would happen if there was rent control are already happening. So we don't have to wait for rent control for Seattle rents to approach cities like New York City and San Francisco. It's already happening. So it was a very contentious meeting, and it's really stirred up feelings in the local community about real estate and development and what's happening to the city as more and more historic buildings are torn down. It just seems like in Seattle, anything over 20 years old is torn down, regardless of its historic value or the beauty of the buildings. There's a beautiful craftsman home called the Hugo House, which is a nonprofit devoted to writers and the literary arts, named after a famous poet from Seattle. And that building is slated to be torn down. There was a beautiful colonial-style, turn-of-the-century apartment building called the Virginia, which literally had the old wooden roll-out beds that came out from beneath the closet that people slept on, and that back in the day was considered a gentleman's hotel where only men were allowed to rent hotel rooms there. But that was torn down with no attempt to preserve it historically in any way. And even if we go back into the last decade, there was actually this issue with the home of Jimi Hendrix, who grew up in the Seattle area. His home was slated for demolition. A benevolent real estate owner in the area, who actually owns a lot of places where artists live relatively inexpensively, his name is Pete Zykov. He paid almost $2 million to move Jimi Hendrix's home to try to save it from demolition. So we've had this issue in Seattle for years. it's come to a head now in a way that it's unprecedented and never seen before. There's a huge polarity between the folks who believe that there has to be some sane development policy that protects, 130-year-old businesses from being wiped out overnight, or entire communities having their culture destroyed, displacement of an entire population just because it's such a wonderful real estate market for investors right now. And as I said before, a lot of local observers and folks who are journalists or reporters are wondering, how long is this bubble going to last? And will we find ourselves reporting soon on another bust in the local economy as major corporations lay off workers and real estate prices, if not drop, fail to skyrocket the way they are now? Microsoft has announced that it's laying off 6% of its entire workforce because they bought Nokia and spent billions of dollars on that. I guess, what would they call it in corporate terms? That buyout. They bought out Nokia, thinking that they were going to be a competitive cell phone manufacturer along with Google and Apple, and unfortunately, their whole enterprise sort of failed. So that acquisition was a major financial failure. Now they're laying off 6% of their workforce, and that is something that happens in the tech industries, which is where Seattle is highly invested right now. There are new technological developments every day, which change the marketplace overnight, and so may not be a long-term stable economy here because of that. We don't know what new developments may take place tomorrow, which could create some new handheld mobile device by a total third or fourth party that could wipe out the competition. So right now, there are other candidates also running for Seattle City Council. In fact, Nick Licata's longtime legislative assistant, Lisa Herbold, is running largely on a platform of affordable housing. She's a very progressive candidate and at least at one point was leading in the polls. There's also John Grant, who is the former head of the tenants union in Seattle. Well, John was invited to serve on the mayor's affordable housing task force, but he told me just the other day during an interview outside of the rent control debate at Town Hall that he's very disappointed in the direction that the mayor's task force is going, that he doesn't really believe that it's going to help low-income renters and residents in the city. And so he's running on a sort of anti-city policy platform right now. And of course, it has been endorsed by the tenants union in Seattle and other affordable housing groups. So there are several candidates that are running right now against established candidates or in open seats who are sort of shaking up the establishment. And part of that, one of those candidates, by the way, I should mention, is Josh Ferris, who is a former Occupy Seattle activist, and also a former veteran of the U.S. military. So he is running in District Number 2, and he's also been endorsed by the tenants union and has taken on this issue of affordable housing. He's actually been a major organizer with a group called Safe in Seattle, which has been fighting home foreclosures since the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations back in 2011. So they've done a lot of work in trying to help people save their homes, a lot of middle-class families living in the Seattle area. So he has sort of surprised people by coming out as a very progressive candidate and actually, formerly Occupy Wall Street activist, which Shama Sawant also claims to be. So there you go. There are many other issues on the ballot, but the major talk is about the city council race because the citizens in Seattle voted to change the districting and representation on our city council. So that's up until now, all of the city council members have been serving at large, which means that they represent the entire community. However, there was some pro-democracy activists actually were thinking, well, if we assign the city council seats by neighborhood, they will be much more responsive to the people who actually live in their community, and they might be more effective in terms of grassroots reforms. So the citizens did approve that idea, and now some of the seats are being allocated according to neighborhood. There's still 2 at-large seats, and then there will be another change in the districting in 2017, all approved by the voters. So it has caused a sort of a shakeup on the city council, and there's a lot of new faces, a lot of grassroots activists and people who have been sort of on the cutting edge of community activism that are actually running for office now. So a door has been opened. That's also happening for the Seattle Port Commission, which, as we've talked about before on our DemocracyCast, Democracy Watch weekly press briefings, has been a very controversial issue as well. The Port Commissioners signed a contract for $13 million with the Shell Oil Corporation, Dutch Royal Shell, and allowed the Polar Pioneer to be moored in Seattle. It's a drilling platform that they're now using up in the Arctic, just off the coast of Alaska. But it's a very, very controversial project that all of the major environmental groups, including the Sierra Club, Greenpeace, Earth Justice, all these groups oppose the idea. The Audubon Society also oppose the idea of Arctic drilling because of the past experiences with the Valdez oil spill and its destruction of the local wildlife population and the fishing. I interviewed a biologist that will be a part of this documentary I'm putting together now, who claims that he advised on the Valdez oil spill cleanup, and that to this day, some of the herring runs and other fish are not back to the levels they were before the Valdez oil spill. And then, of course, we all know about the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico and the devastation that wreaked on the environment and on the fishing industry. So a lot of First Nations people actually have led these protests against Shell, because these tribes up in the Arctic rely on the ocean for their food. And so if there are major oil spills, it could wipe out their population as well as the animals and wildlife, fish, other marine organisms. So the latest story on that is actually that Shell has been dealt a minor setback by regulators because their capping equipment was on a ship that malfunctioned and so had to be sent back to port in the Northwest. So it had to leave Alaska, and so the regulators, even though the Obama administration actually gave them permission to do this oil drilling recently, although they're going to have to move the rigs farther away from each other because they wanted to drill within like 8 or 9 miles of each other. The Obama administration is telling them that until they can bring the capping equipment back up to the Arctic, that they cannot continue their drilling. But there have been major protests all throughout the Northwest, in Seattle, Bellingham, Port Townsend. There was the whole kayaktivist movement where people in kayaks went out to surround the oil drilling rig. There was a activist in Tacoma, or Bellingham, who changed herself to one of the Shell Oil ships as a protest. And so it's been very controversial. The Washington State Department of Natural Resources, the King County Commissioners, the Seattle City Council, and the mayor have all told Shell that the presence of the Polar Pioneer in Elliott Bay was a violation of local law. But Shell appealed all of those citations and continued to moor its oil drilling rig here until about a month ago, when they decided to head back to the Arctic. They do, according to preliminary reports, they do plan to bring the oil rig back in November, once the Arctic is iced over, which we hope happens, and just for environmental reasons, because there have been problems with melt up there. But if they bring it back to Seattle, I'm sure they will be met with major protests once again. And as we discussed on the DemocracyCast press briefings, it's been an interesting example of how local elected officials and commissioners have actually sided with the activists in saying we need to stop this because we're powerless to this corporation who doesn't care whether the Seattle Department of Planning and Development fines it $500 a day because it's violating local law. They can pay that. It's like pocket change to them. They spill more out of their pocket every day. So it was a situation where city council members were actually urging more activists to go down to the port and protest. Now, the Port Commission, the meeting that ended in police arresting one person and physically pushing people out of the building, that's the issue that has brought about a shakeup in the Port Commission election races, because there are some anti-oil drilling candidates who are running for the Port Commission, feeling that the port has not really represented the environmentally progressive and green technology focus of the Puget Sound area, and especially the city of Seattle. So there could be a shakeup on the Port Commission as well. The last Port Commission meeting I went to, the protesters tried to read a citizen's arrest warrant against the commissioners for allowing Shell to be in Elliott Bay, and the Port Commissioners called the meeting, walked out, and the police forced people out of the room. So that's where it stands in Seattle right now on the Shell story. There's also a May Day update, and we've reported about the controversies that take place every year in Seattle on May Day. After the city's official May Day celebration, which usually takes place downtown, there are independent marches that take place mainly on Capitol Hill. And this year was no exception, where there were accusations of people throwing metal objects at police. Some police were injured. Some protesters were injured. The police used crowd control devices like flashbang grenades and these rubber balls that they fire into crowds. So there was some injuries reported, including a reporter for the Seattle Times who was burned by a flashbang grenade that the police were throwing ahead of them, which is another part of my a short documentary that I did on YouTube, showing what happened to me that night when the flashbang grenades were landing in my direction. And by the way, it's very, very painful when something like that lands next to you or is near your eardrum, and you will not be able to hear for a while afterwards. It's very painful and possibly can lead to permanent hearing loss. But also the sparks and the incendiary part of it tends to shoot out sparks that are very superheated. And so a Seattle Times reporter was burned, and I wrote about this issue as an editorial guest columnist at the Capitol Hill Times, talking about how reporters really need to be protected at events like that from these crowd control devices, and talking about sort of how that ties into a larger aspect of freedom of the press in the United States and this issue of reporters really not being protected, because that was official correspondence between me and a city council member's office, where I was informed that actually there is no protection for journalists specifically in terms of crowd control training of the local police department. If you're on the street covering a protest and the police decide to use rubber bullets, there apparently is not any specific training about how to not fire upon reporters, etc. So the only protection supposedly that you have as a reporter, at least in the city of Seattle, is a dispersal order that legally must be given by the police officials, the police department, before they use these crowd control devices. Because it raised the ire of our local council member, Bruce Harrell, who's head of the Public Safety Committee, questions have been brought before the council about the use of these devices. I know Nick Licata's office has been requesting information about the use of flashbang grenades and the lack of training for the use of them. Specifically, flashbang grenades should not be thrown into a crowd, and I think the police understand that because it could cause serious injuries, potentially even death, and it also could cause a stampede. People are frightened, they start running and can injure each other. But what was happening during this particular part of the May Day demonstrations, that the police were lobbying them in front of their police line as they moved up Capitol Hill towards Broadway to keep the protesters from entering downtown. And most of the people, or at least a large percentage of the people in front of the police lines, were actually cameramen, photographers, journalists trying to cover the event, legal observers as well, and medics. So a lot of the people that were injured were not protesters per se. So a recent update on that story is that there were 2 volunteer medics that were injured during Seattle's May Day protests by these police crowd control devices. And they are both suing several high-ranking Seattle police and a group of so far unnamed police officers. That's Jill Frankie Jerkowski is one of the plaintiffs, and the other is Aaron Donnie Clark. They're seeking punitive damages to compensate for their injuries, as well as a permanent injunction prohibiting this group of officers from using excessive force against peaceful protesters. And that was a complaint that was filed in U.S. District Court in Seattle, just about a week ago. So they were 2 volunteers for the Puget Sound Medic Collective, which offers first aid, according to the Seattle Times. The Puget Sound Medic Collective offers first aid, de-escalation, holistic preventative care, and solidarity. Actually, that's according to their own website, the Puget Sound Medic Collective website. So Jerkowski says that she was struck by a blast ball deployed by police while she was treating an injured person on Olive Way and on Capitol Hill. And then shrapnel from the grenade burned through Jerkowski's pant leg, ripped through her leg, and caused large painful hematoma burns, according to the complaint. And then Donnie, the other plaintiff, Aaron Donnie Clark, is a military veteran, was also on Capitol Hill when he said he was struck by a grenade deployed by the Seattle police. And according to his complaint, he suffered injuries to his Achilles tendon, his shin, and his thigh. It took at least 2 weeks to heal, according to the complaint. So both plaintiffs are claiming that their constitutional rights were violated when the police interviewed in their right to engage in political action and free speech. Neither one of them were arrested during the protest. And there was vandalism to some vehicles caused by protesters, and who also hurled projectiles and clashed with police. 16 people were arrested. 4 of them were accused of assaulting police officers. And in the aftermath of this, Seattle City Council member Bruce Harrell, who chairs the Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Technology Committee, questioned the Seattle Police Department's use of blast balls loaded with pepper spray, which can cause serious burns. And there are several internal investigations going on. According to the dissent decree with the U.S. Department of Justice, who investigated the Seattle Police Department for excessive use of force, they must document and report on every use of force and every use of crowd control devices. So eventually, a lot of this information will have to be made public. According to Nick Licata, council member, and others, it takes too long for the police to actually end up reporting on these things. And meanwhile, they're being sued from several different directions by people who claim that they were injured during the use of these devices, including an incident that took place during the Martin Luther King Jr. Day celebrations in Seattle, where a local school teacher was pepper sprayed by police as he was walking across the street in a crosswalk after the demonstration to meet his family, who were standing across the street from him. So that's another lawsuit. It's not a new thing in Seattle. There is an Office of Professional Accountability which conducts internal investigations, but the complaint amongst most of the civil rights groups in Seattle is that the OPA is not effective. It's not a true civilian oversight board. and that until we have that in Seattle, much of the police misconduct, the allegations of police misconduct, are not going to be thoroughly investigated or adjudicated. So there you go. But there is pressure from the Department of Justice for them to clean up their act, and that's why we have a new Seattle police chief, Kathleen O'Toole, who was a member of the Irish National Police Reform Commission and also the former police commissioner from Boston. She is here to help this reform, but I have to report that after the May Day incidents, she sided with the mayor in saying that the police did a great job. And she was also very shocked, according to her own statement, about City Councilman Bruce Harrell's criticism of the crowd control policies. According to Bruce Harrell, the City Council member, if the police had not conducted a very violent arrest of one of the marchers during the march, in the middle of the march, there wouldn't have been such a backlash later, and they wouldn't have had to resort to the use of crowd control devices to disperse the crowd. But that's Bruce Harrell's take on it. We'll see where this story goes. It's an ongoing controversy in Seattle over police accountability, and it's been going on for many years, since even before the World Trade Organization demonstrations, where the Seattle police were accused of using all sorts of unconstitutional crowd control management practices. And in that case, there was an ever-expanding, moving no protest zone, which has never actually been overturned by the U.S. courts, where free speech is basically restricted for limited amounts of time, because according to court precedent, our First Amendment constitutional right to freedom of speech and assembly, to peacefully assemble to address our government for redress of grievances, can be limited. It cannot be eliminated. You can't take that right away, but you can limit it for periods of time and in certain locations for periods of time. So that's Mark Taylor-Canfield reporting from Seattle.
Okay, Mark, and people can catch more updates on our Democracy Movement's weekly international press briefings we have on Thursdays. You find out about that by looking at DWatch News. That's for Democracy Watch News on Twitter, or Democracy Watch News on Facebook. We always make announcements there. I want to thank you, Mark, for the update. A lot of very important things. I'm sure that during the summer we'll be getting some updates from you on the continuing saga of the $15 an hour movement in Seattle, one of the preeminent hubs, Seattle and New York City, and they're continually joined by others.
You can follow my news reports at my Twitter account. I'm also have a YouTube channel, and writing all over the place. So just check me out online, and I will continue to report these breaking news stories out of Seattle. Thanks, Dean. Yes,
and that's M. Taylor Canfield. That's at M. Taylor Canfield on Twitter. With that, I want to thank you, Mark. This has been a special report from Seattle, the first we've had for Democracy Movement's weekly international press briefings. This is not a weekly event. This is a special event. I'm Dean Edwards. I'm coordinating editor at the International Service and the North America Service for Democracy Watch News. Mark is one of our contributing editors, so he pops in and out from time to time with some updates and helps us with some of the administration on a volunteer basis. I have it on good authority from people around the world that we are doing essential work. So let's keep it up. Thank you very much. And I look forward to each of you joining us again. You can listen to these Democracy Cast podcasts on iTunes and other podcast providers. You can keep track of what we're doing on Democracy Watch News on Facebook and Twitter, and also at oximity.com. Very easy to find by doing a search for those. That's the quickest way to get to them. And I want to thank you and invite you to join us again.